As far back as I can remember, I've always been a bit of a horror movie fan. I like the old horror movies, not the that there's so much blood and guts and slashing up people and things like that. I like the older ones, the Universal monsters from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and some of the later things too. But my favorite movie monster would have to be the vampire. Um, but the second most favorite would be the werewolf. And I thought today I'd take a little look at the curse of the werewolf with you, and I hope you'll enjoy. Nearly every society has legends about people who change into animals. In Russia, there are stories of werebears. In Africa, there have been were-leopards, were-hyenas, and were-hippos. In Asia, there are tales about were-tigers, elephants, crocodiles, snakes, and even sharks. Why are these animals singled out? In almost all cases, Nancy Garden writes in her book Werewolves, the animal has these characteristics. 1, it is commonly found in the area. 2, it is feared by many of the inhabitants. And 3, it has been known to attack people and or farm animals. In Europe, wolves fit that profile, and as the population grew over the centuries, Europeans settled in parts of the continent where wolves had roamed freely. As the wildlife that wolves depended on for food began to disappear, they often preyed on livestock, and when food was really scarce, they might even go after humans. As late as 1875, an estimated 160 people were attacked by starving packs of wolves in Russia. So it's not a surprise that when Europeans told scary stories by the fireside, that wolves would be a common subject. Their spooky habit of howling at the moon made them that much more fearsome and fun. No one, not hardly anyone anyways, believes in werewolves today, but in the Middle Ages, they were taken quite seriously. And of all the world's monsters, says Daniel Cohen in his book Werewolves, the werewolf is the one that has been most widely believed in and most widely feared. Here are some of the things people commonly believed about the werewolf. A person could become a werewolf in a number of ways. If he was cursed, drank water from a wolf's paw print, ate the meat of an animal killed by a wolf, wore a girdle made of wolfskin, or used a magic salve. The business about becoming a werewolf after being bitten by another werewolf is basically a creation of the Hollywood movies, says Cohen. Real werewolves don't just bite people, they tore their victims to pieces and then ate them. In some versions of the legend, the werewolf remained human but took on wolf characteristics, such as fur, fangs, and paws. In other variations, the person literally turned into a wolf. Werewolves could be killed by any way that a normal wolf could be killed. So it was commonly accepted, though, that werewolves were in league with the devil. Even educated churchmen who didn't believe human beings could really transform into other animals assumed that the devil was involved. They often said that the devil created the illusion of transformation. He made people think that they had turned into werewolves and made the victim think they were being attacked by the creature. Some authorities believed the real wolf could be turned into a werewolf when the spirit of an evil person entered it. It was possible, therefore, for an evil person to be asleep in his bed at night, or even locked in a cell under the eyes of his jailers, and yet his spirit could roam free as a werewolf. As a result, a lot of people were convicted of being werewolves, even after it was proven that they were nowhere near the place where the werewolf had allegedly committed its crimes. This was serious business in Europe as late as the 18th century. If you were suspected of being a werewolf, you could be put on trial and then put to death. Untold thousands were indeed put to death between 1520 and 1630 AD. An estimated 30,000 cases of werewolfery trials were recorded in central France alone, and thousands more trials took place in other parts of Europe. Two of the best-known werewolves in European history are Peter Stubbe and Jean Grenier, famous as much for what they symbolize as for what they actually did. One was tortured to death, and the other was confined to a mental institution. Stubbe lived in the 1500s, and Grenier lived in the 1800s. Peter Stubbe, it was big news when Stubbe was arrested in Cologne in 1590 and confessed under torture that he was a werewolf. According to his confession, a female demon had given him a magic belt that he could use to turn into a giant wolf, and for nearly 30 years he had supposedly used this power to attack and to kill villagers, livestock, and even wild animals in the surrounding countryside. The townspeople accepted his confession, and he was sentenced. To have his body laid on a wheel and with red-hot burning pincers in 10 places to have the flesh pulled off from the bones, and after that his legs and arms to be broken with a wooden axe or hatchet, afterwards to have his head struck from his body, then to have his carcass burned to ashes. A pamphlet describing Stubbe's crimes and trial illustrated in gruesome detail, and it became a bestseller in all of Europe. Now, Jean Grenier, by the 19th century, authorities were more enlightened about werewolves, and they were skeptical when Grenier, a 13-year-old boy, admitted in 1849 to killing and eating several dogs and several little girls, all of them on Mondays, Fridays, and Sundays, just before dusk, the time when he claimed to become a werewolf. Philip Riley writes in The Wolfman, the town's lawyer asked the court to set aside all thoughts of witchcraft and lycanthropy, and stated that lycanthropy was a state of hallucination, and the change of shape existed only in the disorganized brain of the insane, and therefore not a crime for which he could be held accountable. Instead of sentencing Grenier to death, the judge ordered that he be confined to the monastery at Bordeaux, where he would be instructed in his Christian and moral obligations, under penalty of death if he attempted to escape. And Grenier slid even deeper into madness and died at the monastery 7 years later. He was only 20 years old. Centuries after werewolves roamed Europe, scientists had found some real cures, diseases and physical conditions that may have helped to inspire the legends. Porphyria makes a person extremely sensitive to light, which would cause them to go out only at night. It creates huge wounds on the skin, which people used to think were caused when the afflicted person ran through the woods in the form of a wolf. Hypertrichosis causes excessive growth of thick hair all over the body, including the entire face. The disease is extremely rare, and scientists estimated that as few as 50 people have suffered from the disease since the Middle Ages, but it may have contributed to werewolf legends. When the sufferer shaves off the excess hair, they appear perfectly normal, which may have contributed to the idea that people were changing into wolves. Scientists believe the disease is caused by an atavistic genetic defect, or a mutation that allows long-suppressed genes to become active after thousands of years of dormancy. Human skin cells, the theory speculates, still have the ability to grow thick coats of fur that were normal thousands of years ago, but the evolutionary process has switched it off. Let me interrupt here for just a moment to state that emphatically I do not believe in evolution. I think it's a satanic farce, and that it has been pretty much totally disproven, though people still cling to it for whatever reason they want to be self-deceived. Anyways, the belladonna plant was once eaten as medicine or rubbed on the skin as a salve. It also has hallucinogenic qualities when eaten in large quantities. Eating too much can make people think that they are flying or have turned into wild animals. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that I really liked the werewolf better than any of the other monsters, except for the vampire Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows, and even they had their resident werewolf in Quentin Collins. But let's take just a brief look at some of the wolfmen and werewolves from the movies. The early 1930s was the golden age of movie monsters. In 1930, Universal released the classic Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, and a year later, it had another huge hit with Boris Karloff's Frankenstein. Inspired by their success, Universal decided to make a movie about a werewolf, and in 1931 they handed writer-director Robert Florey a title, The Wolfman, and told him to come up with an outline. A few months later, Florey submitted notes for a story about a Frenchman who had suffered for 400 years under a witch's curse that turns him into a werewolf during every full moon, unless he wears a garland of wolfbane around his neck. The studio approved the idea and scheduled the movie as a Boris Karloff vehicle for 1933. A shooting script was indeed written and rewritten several more times. And by the time it was finished, the script was about an English doctor who is bitten by a werewolf in Tibet, then turns into one himself on his return to London. Universal renamed the picture The Werewolf of London. By now, however, Boris Karloff was too busy to take the part, so it went to a Broadway actor named Henry Hull. Werewolf of London hit theaters in 1935. The movie wasn't really very good, and one critic has called it full of fog, atmosphere, and laboratory shots, but short on chills and horror. That was largely because Hull didn't look scary. He refused to cover his face with werewolf hair, complaining that it obscured his features. Makeup man Jack Pierce, already a legend for creating Bela Lugosi's Dracula and Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, had no choice but to remove most of the facial hair, leaving Hull looking like a demonic forest elf. Werewolf of London was a box office disappointment. It was also Hull's last werewolf film. In the early 1940s, Universal launched a second wave of horror films featuring Dracula, Frankenstein, and other classic monsters, and they decided to give the werewolf another try also. This second werewolf film started the same way that the first one did, with the title The Wolfman. This time, the scriptwriter was Kurt Sodemak. He started from scratch, researched werewolf legends himself, and used what he had learned to write the script. The story he concocted was about an American named Lawrence Talbot who in his travels to his ancestral home in Wales, he was bitten while rescuing a young woman from a werewolf attack. Once again, the studio wanted to cast Karloff in the lead, and once again he was too busy to take it. They considered Bela Lugosi, but he was too old for the part. So they gave it to newcomer Lon Chaney Jr., son and namesake of the greatest horror star of the silent movie era. Chaney Sr. was well known all over the world as the Man of 1,000 Faces for his role in the Phantom of the Opera, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and others. Chaney Jr. had recently starred in Man-Made Monster, and Universal thought he had the potential in horror films. Jack Pierce was still the makeup artist at Universal, and he welcomed the chance to use his original design, a hairy face complete with fangs and a wolfish nose, plus hairy hands and feet. The makeup took a total of 4 hours to apply, most of which was spent applying tufts of fur, authentic yak hair imported from Asia, one by one, and then singeing them to create the wild look. Chaney's Wolfman didn't talk, and all it did was grunt, growl, and howl, and that was no accident. When Chaney was finally made up, he couldn't talk, and he could only eat through a straw. As he recounted years later, the only thing worse than wearing the makeup was taking it off. When he said, what gets me is that when it's after work and I'm all hot and itchy and tired, and I've got to sit in that chair for 45 minutes more while Pierce just about kills me ripping off the stuff he put on in the morning. Sometimes we take an hour and leave some of the skin on my face." End quote. Most actors would probably have refused to wear such difficult makeup, but Chaney, whose real first name was Crichton, had no choice. He was desperate to make it in the film business. While he was alive, Lon Chaney Sr. had fought Crichton's attempts to become an actor. He even forced his son out of Hollywood High and into a plumbing school when he asked to take acting lessons. As Chaney Sr.'s career soared to its heights in the late 1920s, Chaney Jr. was working as a boilermaker. The elder Chaney died of throat cancer in 1930, and Crichton Chaney signed with RKO Studios 2 years later. After moving from bit part to bit part for more than 2 years, he reluctantly changed his name to Lon Chaney Jr. to cash in on his father's fame, and they had to starve me to make me take his name, he groused years later. Finally, in 1939, only days after his car and furniture were repossessed by a furniture company, Shaney scored a hit in a stage version of Mice and Men, and that led to a starring role in the movie version, and in 1940 a contract with Universal Pictures. The studio had modest hopes for The Wolfman. They scheduled it for release on December 11, 1941, right before Christmas, but on December 7th, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States entered World War II. Universal was sure that the movie would become a box office disaster. After all, who was going to take time out for movies when we were going to war? To their surprise, it was a huge hit. The film played to packed movie houses all over the country and was the studio's biggest moneymaker of the season. It established the Wolfman as an important movie monster along with Dracula and Frankenstein. It almost single-handedly made werewolves a part of popular culture, and it turned Lon Chaney into one of the best-known actors in the country. World War II probably had more to do with making the Wolfman a hit than any other factor. What Universal had failed to realize was that the war fueled a need for the kind of escape that horror films provide. Inside a darkened theater, moviegoers could forget their troubles, at least for a while, as they watched ordinary mortals triumph over seemingly insurmountable evil. As David Scow writes in The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror, Talbot's four-film quest to put to rest his werewolf self is, in a strange way, an unconscious parable of the war effort, the Wolfman's crusade for eternal peace, and his frustrated attempts to control irrational, violent European forces. The Wolfman's saga was the most consistent and sustained monster myth of the war, beginning with the first year of America's direct involvement in the war and finishing up just in time for Hiroshima. The hardest scene to shoot was the final metamorphosis scene in which Chaney turns from a werewolf to a human as he dies. Chaney described the process as follows. The way we did the transformation was that I came in at 2 a.m., and when I hit the position, they'd take little nails and drive them through the skin at the edge of my fingers on both hands so that I wouldn't move them anymore. While I was in this position, they would take the camera and weigh it down with 1 ton so that it wouldn't move when people walked. They had targets for my eyes. And then they would shoot 5 or 10 frames of film in the camera. They'd take out the film and send it to the lab. And while it was there, the makeup man would come and take the whole thing off my face and put on a new one. I'm still immobile. When the film came back from the lab, they'd put it back in the camera, and then they'd check me. They'd say, your eyes have moved a little bit. Move them to the right. And then they'd roll it again and shoot another 10 frames. Well, we did 21 changes of makeup, and it took 22 hours. I won't discuss about the bathroom. For the rest of the cast and crew, the worst part of filming The Wolfman was breathing the special effects fog that was used in the outdoor scenes. The kind of fog they used in those days was nothing like the kind we have today. Cameraman Phil Lathrop remembers. It was greasy stuff made of mineral oil. We worked in it for weeks, and the entire cast and crew had sore eyes and intestinal trouble the entire time. And besides that, we were all shivering with cold because it was necessary to keep the temperature below 50 degrees when using the fog. Female lead Evelyn Ankers fainted on the set after inhaling too much fog during a chase sequence. The Wolfman made a lot of money for Universal, but not as much of it filtered down to the writers and actors who actually brought it to life. My salary, Chaney said, was $400 a week. Scriptwriter Kurt Sedemak recalls when the picture made its first million, the producer got a $10,000 bonus, and the director got a diamond ring for his wife, and I got fired since I wanted $25 more for my next job. There were a number of sequels, of course, to The Wolfman, and Chaney made 4 Wolfman movies in total for Universal during the war years, more than Universal made of Dracula or Frankenstein. The others were Frankenstein meets the Wolfman in 1943, where Shaney travels to Castle Frankenstein to see if he can find a cure for his Wolfman condition in Dr. Frankenstein's notes. All he finds is the Frankenstein monster, played by Bela Lugosi, who had turned down the original Frankenstein in 1931 because there wasn't any dialogue. Lugosi played a particularly stiff Frankenstein, not just because he was growing old, but also because the original version of the film, Frankenstein is left behind and mute after a botched brain transplant. In the version released to theaters, all references to blindness, muteness, and the brain transplant were removed, so he just looks old. Then there was The House of Frankenstein in 1944, where mad scientist Dr. Gustav Niemann, played by Boris Karloff, escapes from an insane asylum with the help of his hunchback assistant Daniel, played by J. Carrol Naish, and flees to Castle Frankenstein. There he teams up with Dracula, played by John Carradine, and Frankenstein, played by Glenn Strange, and of course, the Wolfman, played by Shaney, to terrorize the countryside until they are finally killed by the villagers. House of Dracula in 1945, Dr. Franz Edelman, played by Onslow Stevens, finds a way to cure Dracula, John Carradine, of his vampirism, but Dracula refuses to submit. Instead, he bites Dr. Edelman and turns him into a vampire, and then Edelman rises Frankenstein from the dead just as the Wolfman arrives on the scene. Originally titled The Wolfman vs. Dracula, the movie had to be renamed because the Wolfman and Dracula do not actually meet in the film. And then, of course, there was one of my favorites, Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein, from 1948. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello team up with the Wolfman to prevent Dracula, played by Lugosi, and a mad female scientist, Lenore Aubert, from transplanting Costello's brain into the Frankenstein monster. Critics say the film is symbolic of the decline of Universal's horror classics in the late 1940s, and fans say it's one of the best films Abbott and Costello ever made, and I would agree 100%. Shaney would reprise the Wolfman role in movies and television for the rest of his life, including appearances on The Pat Boone Show and on Route 66. He also played the Frankenstein monster in The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1932, Count Dracula and Son of Dracula in 1943, and The Mummy in 3 Mummy movies. A heavy drinker, by the 1960s he was reduced to appearing in low-budget schlock like Face of the Screaming Werewolf in 65, Hillbillies in the Haunted House in 67, and Dracula vs. Frankenstein in 1970, and he died of a heart attack in 1973, but the Wolfman lives on. Like all classic Hollywood monsters, the Wolfman was spun off into dozens of movies, many of them low budget, some just plain unusual. Let's, for an example, take these ones. I Was a Teenage Werewolf from 1947, the original teenage horror film. I Was a Teenage Werewolf was filmed in 7 days at a cost of $125,000 and made $2 million. It launched an entire genre of low-budget B-movie films, including I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, I Was a Teenage Zombie, and I Was a Teenage TB Terrorist. The movie stars a young Michael Landon of Bonanza and Little House on the Prairie fame. In his first feature film role, he plays an emotionally disturbed teenager seeking treatment for his problems, and a mad scientist hypnotizes him and regresses him so far back in time that he becomes a prehistoric werewolf. And Landon's girlfriend is not amused, and neither are the police. They gun him down at the end of the film. The Mad Monster from 1942, Dr. Cameron, a mad scientist, injects a handyman with the blood of a wolf, turning him into the prototype of an army of wolfmen to battle the Nazis. In the end, however, Dr. Cameron succumbs to pettiness and uses the werewolf to kill the men he believes responsible for destroying his reputation. When the film banned in the UK until 1952, it was finally released with an X rating and a medical disclaimer touting the safety of blood transfusions. In 1961, we had Werewolf in a Girl's Dormitory, when a series of ghastly murders take place at a correctional school for wayward girls. Investigators discover that Mr. Swift, the school superintendent, is, guess what, a werewolf. Werewolves on Wheels in 1971, with surfing music blaring on the soundtrack, motorcycle gang members curse, attend impromptu orgies, drink barrels of beer, and rough up some monks. In retaliation, cyclists are cursed with lycanthropy, and they're turned into werewolves. What follows is some very unintentional comedy and some very unnecessary nudity. 1993 saw Lena Meets Frankenstein, a hardcore remake of Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein, which changes from black and white to color for the sex scenes. When the car breaks down, two streetwise babes are stranded at a timeshare condo with the classic monsters, and the Wolfman Dracula, his vampire wives, and Frankenstein monster are all on hand. And there were many more. There was The Rats Are Coming, The Werewolves Are Here from 1972. And there was also Night Stalkers from 1995. Werewolf of Woodstock, 1975. Curse of Queen Wolf, 1987. And The Werewolf and the Yeti in 1975. Full Moon High, 1981. And Blood in 1974. And I would assume that we have not seen the last of that great movie monster, as I'm sure there will be more films to come. Thanks for stopping by and taking a listen.